Hi, my name is Emily Vicioso, and this is Quantifying Ecological and Economic Value of Pest Control Services Provided by Bats in a Vineyard Landscape of Central Chile. The researchers in this study started with the idea that bats perform the ecosystem service of eating pest insects. Bats are previously known to consume pests in vineyards, but no one had yet quantified that particular ecosystem benefit. The researchers used control and bat exclusion plots, and they measured the fruit and vine damage, the yields within the vineyard, and then the resultant economic value. This study provides the first evidence of bats performing this service in vineyards and serves as an argument for using bats in pest suppression and biodiversity and conservation of agricultural systems in the future. This is one of the bats. This is one of the common insectivorous bats in Chile. It's called the Brazilian free-tailed bat, or Tatarita brasiliensis. Here we go. At the start of the study, a link had not yet been made between the bats eating vineyard pests and grapevine yield. But this link could promote the conservation of local habitats and species, as well as economically benefit wine growers. The effort of this study involves evaluating insect damage to the vines, determining whether an increase in bat activity correlates with a decrease in vine damage, and determine whether the bats are actually eating the pest species. They also will value the resulting reduction in damage. Okay. The researchers conducted their research in 3 vineyards, 2 organic and 1 in the process of becoming organic. Each vineyard had a control plot, which didn't have any exclusion tactics, and 1 plot which was excluded from bats, designed using netting, wire cables, and poles. You can see the exclusion plot here in this image. The netting allowed for the movement of nocturnal insects, which includes some of the larger lepidopterans as well. The netting could be removed after every night to allow for any daytime activity, including any visitation from birds. The study period was during the period of time when bats and insects were highly active, and the vines had both fruit and leaves on them. The researchers looked at the leaf herbivory damage to the fruit and quantity of arthropods and larvae or pupae. Within each plot, the researchers looked at 15 grapevines distributed throughout the plot. They chose 5 leaves every 12 to 18 days, 6 times throughout the study, to measure leaf herbivory and insect abundance. By the end of the study, 450 leaves were sampled for every plot. Leaf herbivory was measured by percent of the leaf consumed, and the same method was used to evaluate grape damage. A total of 76 clusters of grapes had been sampled by the end of the study. A bat survey was also conducted using a bat detector and a microphone placed within 75 meters of both plots at 4.5 meters from the ground, recording for 10 hours every night. Each vineyard was sampled for 4 to 5 nights consecutively, for a total of 18 nights each vineyard. And this is an aerial view of the same thing. It's a little fuzzy, but you can see exclusion plot here, control plot here, no exclusion. And then this is the microphone to detect the bat movement. Okay, each vineyard, oh no, let's see, where was I? The researchers analyzed fecal pellets of 2 of the common species of bats. The DNA of the bat's prey was then isolated and identified, and then they were able to analyze the potential economic effect on the vineyards by comparing grape yield, change in damage between the plots, and their cost at market. The researchers' hypotheses, if I can get there. Okay, so the researchers' hypotheses are that bats suppress herbivorous insects, which reduces leaf herbivory and cluster damage in the vineyards. So in this case, our null hypothesis would be that bats don't cause a reduction in leaf damage or grape damage in the vineyards. There would be no statistical difference between damage in control plots and damage in exclusion plots. And there would be no correlation between the insects that the bats consume and the pest insects in the vineyard. Also, there'd be no difference in economic value in the control or versus the exclusion plots. So then the alternative hypothesis would be that bats do cause a reduction in leaf and grape damage, and then there would be a correlation between bat activity and the pest insects in the vineyard. One test plot did have eggs from a pest insect, the brown Chilean leaf-footed bug, but there was no insect larva or pupae on any of the plots. And you can read through these, but let's take a look at this chart here. This is chart A. And chart A shows us the index of herbivory, which is the number of leaves damaged in comparison to the number sampled. This here is the dependent variable, and the sampling period, or the time over which the researchers measured the plots, is the independent variable. There was a significant difference in the control plots, which are here with the filled in circles, and the exclusion, which are the open circles. The bars on the graph indicate the statistical error, and the p-value was found to be 0.004, which is low and means that there is a significance difference between the two test plots. So we can reliably say that there was a significant difference in leaf predation between the control and the bat exclusion. There was, however, no significant difference in the leaf damage, right, with a p-value of 0.942 over time. So the leaf damage stayed relatively the same. Chart B, we're looking at the number of damaged grapes per cluster over the sampling period. Again, filled in circles are control, open circles are exclusion plots. We see that the number of damaged grapes varies significantly between plots with a p-value of 0.001 right there. And we see that the difference over time in grape production is also significantly different with a p-value of 0.015. So unlike this one, we have grapes, an increase of predation on the grapes over time, which means likely that there were not as many grapes at this point in time, and then the grapes developed and grew and ripened, and then we saw more predation. You can also see some of the damaged grapes here in image 4. And here we have chart C, which shows this bad activity compared to the index of damage reduction. So the filled in circles here are bad activity. Open squares are the average damage of reduction, right? Okay, so we see that that total bad activity and damage index followed the same trend over time, which is supported by a significant positive association between the two variables. And that's with a p-value of 0.034. Finally, we have figures A and B. After the researchers were able to evaluate the bat pellets from Taderia brasiliensis, they were able to determine which insects they ate. And figure A shows us the distribution of the orders. Here we have 5 orders, and you can see that about 78% of their diet is Lepidoptera, and the rest are other insects. That means that a significant portion of their diet are moths. Figure B then shows us how much of each species as percentages within their order are consumed by bats. And this was a little bit of a confusing graph at first. But if we look on the left side, we see that the researchers were able to determine the number of each species consumed. Here we go. And then we see the percentage of each species within the family here on the right. Here's the families. This is the percentage of each species within these families. So the order is represented by these colorful shapes. So for example, if we're looking at Diptera, we have these 2 species here. We see that about 50% of each species are consumed, right? So that's about half and half. So we can then see, if we look to Lepidoptera, we see that about 3 out of the 4 lepidopterans made up about 20% of the bat's diet. So it's about 60% total, and almost 40% were this one, which is LS, or Leucoptera sinuella. So this just shows us that the researchers are able to look at exactly which species the bats are eating and then in what quantities. And if you are able to click over and read the paper, you're going to find a similar graphic for the other common bat species, which is Myotis chiloensis. Interestingly, we see that while Taderia prefers lepidopterans, Myotis actually had a much more varied diet. Overall, this study supports the idea that bats improve the economic value of vineyards. Many of the insect species, particularly moths, are known to predate other crops like cabbages and apples. So bats might be of use in other crop species fields. In this study, the bats prevented damage, equating to about 7% of the total grape production in the plots. The study was conducted in organic vineyards, and the researchers were unsure what the effects of pesticides would have on conventional farms. But the effects of climate change and rising temperatures could increase the significance and severity of pest outbreaks in farms. And if there are more pests, then the value of pest control that the bats offer could actually increase. They could also eventually provide a resistance to these sorts of outbreaks. Also, bat activity increases in vineyards with a higher diversity of cover types and those that are closer to hedgerows and near waterways. This is the first study that wherein researchers were able to evaluate and measure the services provided by bats, and the top-down ecological effects of the bats are able to reduce herbivory rates and cluster damage in vineyards, and likely many of the other crops and agroecosystems. So bats should be included in vineyards as a biological suppressor of pests, and we should all be considering the use of our local bats in pest suppression, in our biodiversity efforts, and in conservation. Oops. Okay. Thank you so much for your time.